Michael Hansen had always believed in the importance of boundaries. In life, in business, in conversation, and certainly in property. So when he and his wife Jana finally found a home that offered quiet seclusion at the end of a symmetrical, dead-end street, it felt more like a strategic acquisition than a casual real estate purchase. The two had spent over 3 decades working, he in land development consultation, she in tax compliance, and were finally entering that phase of life where time slows down, where the goal shifts from achievement to peace. The house they chose wasn't just aesthetically clean and structurally sound. It was positioned with surgical precision at the edge of a neighborhood obsessed with order. Equal lots, mirrored architecture, no visible trash bins, and grass so level it looked ironed. Everything about it appealed to Michael's craving for structure and Jana's distaste for unpredictability. That street, with its mature trees spaced like soldiers and driveways poured with millimeter-consistent edges, promised tranquility. They wanted order. They got it. On the surface, anyway. Their first week passed with the type of satisfaction that makes you believe you finally made the right decision. Jana unpacked boxes in her usual methodical manner, labeling everything from drawer dividers to flashlight batteries. Michael walked the perimeter every morning with a coffee in hand, noting small things to fix. The loosened gate hinge, a slightly off-level paver, a bush that would need trimming come fall. The neighbor across the cul-de-sac, Bernice, waved at them twice. That was more than enough interaction. Michael wasn't unfriendly, but he didn't believe in small talk with people who might one day contest the color of your fence or complain about the way your sprinklers rotated. Jana shared the sentiment. They wanted to be seen, not heard, and certainly not involved. It was on their 9th day that the first disruption came. Michael found it when he went to collect the mail. An envelope without a stamp, without a name, just a single word typed on the front in uppercase letters. Warning. Inside was a sheet of thick, textured paper, perfectly folded, and on it, typed in a stark serif font, was one line. Do not park outside the boundaries. This is the first and only reminder. There was no signature, no indication of who it came from. Michael turned the paper over, then back again, expecting maybe a return address or a logo. Nothing. It was as cold and impersonal as a violation notice pinned to a construction site. Except this wasn't a city warning, and it wasn't posted publicly. It was placed intentionally, privately, quietly. Jana read it in the kitchen, holding the paper with the same distaste she had once reserved for eviction notices served to tenants years ago. It's not even specific, she said, frowning. What boundaries? What parking? We've used our own driveway, always. She was right. Michael had parked his truck a few inches off-center the day before to avoid a puddle forming near the curb, but it hadn't crossed into another property. Not even close. He dropped the letter into the drawer by the fridge where they kept house manuals and warranties. Someone's got too much time on their hands, he muttered. They would have dismissed it entirely, if not for what came next. The man who lived next door, a square-shouldered figure with a high and tight haircut and a posture like an ex-military instructor, began to make himself noticed. Not through noise or overt behavior, but through ritual. Every morning, at precisely 7:06 a.m., he would exit his house wearing long sleeves and dark cargo pants, despite the heat, and begin pushing a weighted manual lawn roller across his yard in perfectly aligned rows. He never acknowledged them, never looked up, never waved. The roller made a low, metallic hum that resonated across the driveway like a tuning fork, and always started the moment Jana opened the blinds in their bedroom. She mentioned it once. Michael shrugged. Coincidences happened. But she began changing the time she opened them. Once earlier, once later, the roller always followed. Then came the chalk line. It appeared one morning while Michael was restocking the garage shelves, just a clean, precise white line running along the edge of their driveway, across the base of the mailbox post and onto their side of the sidewalk. It wasn't random. It was applied with care, using a guide. Michael stared at it for several minutes, then stepped back to check the symmetry. It wasn't crooked, it wasn't messy, it was a message. Jaina came out later and said nothing. She just stared at the line, then looked up at Michael with a question she didn't need to say aloud. That night, as Michael unloaded gardening tools from the bed of his truck, the neighbor stood at the edge of their lawn, perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, watching, not glaring, not threatening, just watching, like someone inspecting a fence that wasn't quite up to code. Michael didn't approach. He wasn't the type to pick a fight over looks or posture, but something about the man's silence, the deliberate placement of his feet, the way he stood just outside their property line as if testing it, made Michael's chest tighten. Jaina stood behind the screen door, her hand resting on the frame. Did he say anything? Nope. He gives me the creeps. Yeah, Michael said, finally turning back to his truck. Me too. The next morning, their mailbox was open, mail soaked through. Not by rain, there hadn't been any. It was like someone had held it under a faucet, just enough to ruin the ink. That same day, their trash bins had been wheeled 6 feet further down the street than usual, sitting crookedly across the neighbor's driveway. Jaina retrieved them with shaking hands. We didn't leave them there, she insisted. I know. The line remained on the driveway, undisturbed. Michael tried washing it off with a hose, but the chalk resisted water. It wasn't regular sidewalk chalk. It was something more permanent. They didn't sleep well that night. 2 days later, after a grocery run, Michael parked his SUV at a slight angle on the driveway again, just a few inches closer to the grass. It wasn't intentional. He was maneuvering around some branches the landscapers had left piled at the curb. The thought of that first letter flashed in his mind, but he shook it off. That night passed quietly. The next morning did not. Michael walked out with a mug of coffee and immediately dropped it. His SUV, the one he had bought 6 months ago, was shredded. Not keyed. Not vandalized in some juvenile outburst. It had been methodically, almost surgically, destroyed. The windshield was slashed diagonally from edge to edge, clean through the safety laminate. The side mirrors were missing entirely. The hood bore 3 long gashes, deep and curved, as if someone had taken a heavy-toothed blade and dragged it with precision. There was no spray paint, no profanity, no broken glass beyond what had fallen naturally from the mirrors. But sitting on the passenger seat, clearly placed through the shattered window, was a thin, polished wooden slat. On it, burned in block lettering, were 3 words: line breached, corrected. Jaina screamed when she saw it. Michael didn't. He didn't say a word. He stood there, breathing through his nose, hands at his sides, and felt his pulse slow not from panic, but from a cold, focused rage. This wasn't random. This wasn't vandalism. This was ritual. And someone had just declared a war he wasn't ready to lose. Michael's first call was to the police, and he made it before even touching the car. He knew better than to disturb a scene like that. 30 years in development taught him that documentation was everything when property lines, damage, and legal responsibility started to intertwine. The dispatcher's tone was neutral, though she asked twice if there was any blood. When Michael said no, only damage to the vehicle, she gave the standard response. An officer would be dispatched as soon as one became available. Jaina stood on the porch, arms folded tightly across her chest, her mouth a thin line. She didn't speak much. Her hands were trembling, though she kept them close to her body like she was trying not to show it. The officer arrived 40 minutes later, a tired-looking man in his 40s with a shaved head and a faint limp. He introduced himself as Officer Cray and immediately began asking questions. When did you last see the car intact? Did you hear anything overnight? Do you have any security cameras, and have you had any disputes with neighbors? Michael answered honestly. No footage, no audio, no witnesses, and no formal disputes. He mentioned the letter, the chalk line, the morning routines, and the unmarked envelope. Cray listened, nodding occasionally but writing very little. When Jaina handed over the wooden slat with the burned words, Cray examined it for a long moment before sighing. "No prints," he said, almost to himself, then added, "You said this was found inside the car?" "Yes," Michael said. "Someone reached in through the broken glass and placed it." "Placed, not tossed?" "Exactly." Cray's nod was almost reluctant, like he was trying to fit this into a category that didn't exist on his clipboard. "That's deliberate. Which makes this a targeted act. But without witnesses or footage, we're stuck. I'll file the report, take photos, and escalate this as a property destruction incident. You'll get a copy for your insurance. But unless you catch the guy in the act, we're limited." Jaina frowned. "That's it?" "For now." Cray didn't sound proud of it. Michael didn't argue. He watched the officer document the damage with a digital camera, methodically circling the car and muttering measurements into a voice recorder. When he was done, he handed Michael a card with the case number. "You'll want to file this with your insurance right away. If you feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call us again. If you catch anything on a camera later, even if it's minor, let us know." Jaina asked if it was safe to clean the car. Cray gave a short nod, said they had what they needed, and walked back to his patrol car. He didn't look at the neighbor's house once. Michael watched him drive away, then turned toward the empty front of the neighboring property. The blinds were drawn, no lights on, no movement, just that quiet, oppressive stillness that seemed to thicken the longer you looked at it. The insurance company wasn't much more helpful. Michael called them as soon as he had the report in hand, emailed everything, answered all the questions, and waited through 3 holds and 2 transfers. Finally, a claims rep told him the incident would fall under malicious destruction, and that they'd begin an assessment, but added with corporate precision that if no suspect was identified, and without surveillance footage or external corroboration, the claim might be denied under their unverified incident clause. Michael hung up before the woman could finish the sentence. Jaina didn't ask what they said. She already knew from his face. The car was towed the next morning. Watching it being pulled onto the flatbed, its disfigured hood glinting under morning sun, felt more intimate than Michael expected. That vehicle had been his investment, his tool, and, more importantly, a symbol of the structured life they'd worked hard to build. Now it was evidence of something else. He didn't speak while the tow driver worked, and the man didn't ask questions. When it was gone, Michael stood in the empty driveway for almost 10 minutes. Jaina didn't interrupt. Later that day, she noticed a new detail. Around the edge of the driveway where the concrete met the trimmed grass, small metal stakes had been inserted, flat, triangular pieces that sat flush with the ground. At first glance, they looked like part of the irrigation system, but upon closer inspection, they weren't connected to anything. No tubing, no wiring, just smooth steel shapes embedded in a perfect line, as if someone had surveyed and staked a new border. Michael crouched, pried one loose with a screwdriver, and found a number etched on the underside, 7A. Another stake had 7A plus 1. A third read 7B. Jaina asked what it meant. Michael didn't answer. He took them inside, cleaned them, laid them out on the kitchen island. After a few minutes of silent analysis, he quietly said, "They're grid markers. Someone mapped out our property manually. This isn't about landscaping. This is about control." That night, he went online and pulled the parcel maps from the county assessor's office. He cross-referenced their lot with archived zoning permits, historical surveys, and infrastructure records. Their land was legally sound. Clear titles, clean boundaries, properly recorded setbacks. Nothing that could be argued. Nothing ambiguous. But then he found something buried in a zoning amendment from 1993. A minor ordinance addendum about decorative spatial consistency within designated suburban developments, specifically referencing non-intrusive boundary expectations. The language, was vague, clearly written more for aesthetic committees than legal enforcement. But it was there, and it was cited. Michael printed it, stapled it to their current parcel map, and stared at the contrast. The law said one thing. The culture of the neighborhood, whatever it was, said another. The next morning they received a letter in the mail, this time with a typed return address. Local Residential Council. No logo, no personal names. The envelope was heavy, hand-sealed, and inside was a printed notice titled Pattern Deviation Inquiry, Resident 7B, or it referenced an alleged non-compliant vehicle orientation and the resulting visual obstruction encroaching on unified frontage standards. The letter requested that the residents of 7B acknowledge the deviation and respond in writing with either an acceptance of recommended adjustments or a formal appeal through the alignment board. Jaina read the entire thing aloud, her voice flat. There's no phone number, no website, just a P.O. box. Michael took the letter, scanned it again, and finally said, "This is fake structure. Bureaucracy without legality. Just intimidation. But it looks real. That's the point." They debated what to do next. Jaina wanted to contact a real estate attorney. Michael agreed, but said they needed more than suspicion. They needed documentation. They needed to know what they were fighting. That afternoon, Michael walked the property line again and noticed that one of the chalk lines on the curb had been reapplied. But with a subtle shift, it now extended into the asphalt, 2 inches deeper than before. Someone was creeping the line forward, inch by inch, like testing how much they could push before being stopped. At 6:38 that evening, they heard the sound of metal on concrete. Michael stepped outside just in time to see the neighbor, Roy, as they finally learned from an old piece of misdelivered mail, dragging what looked like a homemade leveling rod across the sidewalk. He wore the same long sleeves, the same dark pants, and had a tool belt around his waist. As Michael approached the edge of his own driveway, Roy didn't stop. He didn't acknowledge him. He just dragged the rod until it reached the new chalk mark, pressed a button on a handheld device, and scribbled a note on a small pad. "Evening," Michael said, voice calm. Roy didn't reply. "You marking something?" No answer. Michael didn't press it. He stepped back onto his property, eyes never leaving Roy's hands. The man packed up his tools, returned to his house, and shut the door without a word. Back inside, Michael sat at the kitchen table and said, "We're not dealing with a neighbor. We're dealing with someone who thinks he's a surveyor, an enforcer, and an architect all in one. This isn't about land. It's ideology." Jaina placed her hand over his. "So, what do we do?" Michael looked toward the blinds already drawn for the night. "We prepare, and we document, and we make sure that next time we don't just call the cops, we call someone who can make this stop legally and permanently." They didn't sleep much that night, and when they woke, the first thing they saw was a new mark on the driveway. Not a line this time, but a number. 7B. No explanation. Just that, written in precise white paint. Jaina turned away. Michael stared at it like a starting pistol had gone off. And the race, it seemed, had just begun. The number on the driveway didn't wash off. Michael tried, first with the garden hose, then with a stiff-bristled brush and dish soap, then finally with a chemical cleaner meant for oil stains. The paint barely smudged. It wasn't spray paint or chalk, but something else. Some industrial mix meant to bond with concrete. Jaina stood behind him on the porch, arms folded tightly under her robe as she watched his third attempt. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say. The message wasn't for them. It was about them. And it was clear. They had been labeled. The property was now not just marked, it was cataloged. Like they were part of some grid Roy believed he maintained, not just physically but conceptually. After half an hour, Michael gave up. He left the number where it was and walked back into the house without a word, scrubbing his hands at the sink until the bristles left red streaks along his knuckles. Jaina didn't ask him anything. She just made coffee, put 2 mugs on the table, and took out the envelope from the local residential council again. They both stared at it. It hadn't changed. No new letter. No second follow-up. Just the number on the driveway, now fixed like a scar. That day, Michael made the call to an attorney he'd worked with years ago. A sharp, no-nonsense woman named Denise Parks, who had handled several property and boundary cases for him in the past. She wasn't cheap, but she was thorough, and she didn't like being messed with. He left her a message. 2 hours later, she called back. After he explained everything, the letter, the neighbor, the paint, the stakes, the wooden slat, she paused only once when he mentioned the zoning clause from 1993. If that clause is being referenced by a non-governmental body, she said, that's a problem, especially if it's being used to intimidate or imply legal authority. I'll look into it. In the meantime, I want you to document everything. Photos, timestamps, measurements. Don't touch anything else they mark. Let them build their case. If they think they're smart, let them keep digging. Michael agreed. That evening, he set up a camera inside the front window, not outside where it could be tampered with, but behind the glass, nestled between 2 indoor plants. It had a wide lens, motion detection, and cloud backup. He didn't tell anyone, not even Jaina, until the setup was complete. It wasn't a matter of hiding it from her. It was about not talking plans out loud anymore. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of their house. Their words felt vulnerable now, like even their walls might be listening. That night, Roy returned. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the camera caught him emerging from the darkness like a shadow with purpose. He wore the same black cargo pants, the same sleeves, the same posture. In his hands was what looked like a tool of some kind. Long, thin, metal, though it was hard to identify from the angle. He knelt at the edge of the lawn, right near the number on the driveway, and worked for 2 minutes. Then he rose, stepped back into the darkness, and vanished. The next morning, Michael found what he had done. Directly below the number 7B, Roy had embedded a small reflective disc into the concrete. The disc was no bigger than a coin, but it glinted in the sun like a silent alarm. Jaina bent down to touch it, but Michael stopped her. "Don't," he said. "We'll photograph it, not disturb it." Denise called back that afternoon. "I ran the address," she said. "There's no registered council with that name. It's not a recognized homeowners group, it's not a county extension, and it's not tied to any legal zoning entity. It's a shell, which means someone went through a lot of effort to make it look real. You're not dealing with disorganization. You're dealing with obsession." Michael asked what they should do next. Denise was blunt. "Don't confront him. Don't engage. We'll file a preemptive report with the county. If this escalates, I'll file a civil injunction, but we need more. Keep gathering. And start documenting any surveillance or measurement activity that crosses onto your land, especially at night." Michael nodded. That night, he moved the camera. He added a second one, this one pointing at the side gate, the narrow gravel path that led toward the rear of the property. The windows stayed closed, lights off. They didn't sleep much. At 3:12 a.m., the second camera triggered. Someone, unmistakably Roy, had approached the side gate and placed something beneath the latch. The image wasn't sharp enough to tell what it was, but it had weight. In the morning, Michael checked and found a small, lead-filled plumb bob tied to the handle, just hanging there, unmoving. Balanced. Measured. Not a message. A method. Roy wasn't sending threats. He was charting precision. Jaina refused to leave the house that day. She called her sister, pretending everything was fine. Michael walked the perimeter with a notepad and tape measure, recording every angle, every line, every boundary as it appeared in his original blueprints. Nothing had shifted physically, but the sense of territory had mutated. It no longer felt like their property. It felt like borrowed space, like a section of a larger equation they were never consulted about. That evening, they received a formal letter delivered by courier. No stamps, no return address. Inside was a folded sheet labeled Alignment Deviation Notice, Second Tier. It included a new map, identical to the parcel map Michael had downloaded, except this one had Roy's lot outlined in red, and theirs shaded in gray. The legend included terms like protruding elements, non-harmonic frontage deviation, and obstructed field of boundary cohesion. It was pure nonsense, but it was structured nonsense. And at the bottom, a signature, R.W., Enforcement Liaison. Jaina sat at the table in silence for almost 20 minutes after reading it. Then she stood, walked into the garage, and locked the side door from the inside. She didn't say anything for the rest of the evening. Michael sent the document to Denise, who called back at 9:42 p.m., her voice tight. This guy's building a case. A fake one, but a detailed one. He's not crazy, he's methodical. He's using legal language stripped of authority but formatted to intimidate. This is structured psychological warfare. I'm putting together a restraining order request. You won't need to serve it yet. But when it hits, it'll hit hard. Michael asked what they should do in the meantime. You wait, she said. You watch. You don't blink. The next morning, Michael stepped outside and found something new on the curb. A single cement block, perfectly centered in front of their driveway with a tiny brass plate affixed to the top. The plate read, Pending Reclassification. He didn't touch it. He called Denise. She told him to take photos, then call the non-emergency line and report a suspicious placement of objects in the right-of-way. Cray showed up again, clearly annoyed but professional. He took notes, filed the complaint, asked a few questions, then finally said, You think this is going to keep going? Michael didn't answer. He didn't need to. Cray nodded and left. That night, they turned off every light, closed every shade, sat in silence. When the camera alerted, Michael didn't flinch. He just opened the feed. Roy had returned to the driveway, this time carrying a wheeled case. He worked for 6 minutes, silently, carefully, then left. In the morning, the cement block was gone. In its place were 3 more reflective discs, evenly spaced in a triangle formation, and another number, 7B. Michael took photos. Jaina didn't even come outside, and just like that, the first line had become a grid. And Roy, in whatever broken architecture he believed in, had begun drawing his map directly onto their lives. Michael knew they were crossing a threshold when Denise's voice over the phone shifted from firm to grim. She had reviewed the most recent photos. The reflective discs, the triangle, the etched markings on the curb, and had fallen silent for nearly a full minute before finally speaking. We're no longer in the realm of eccentricity, she said. This is encroachment layered with psychological operations. The man is trying to create a framework in which you're the aberration. He's manufacturing spatial guilt. Michael didn't reply. He stood by the kitchen counter with his phone pressed to his ear, staring out the window as Roy slowly walked his property line with what looked like a surveyor's rod in one hand and a small notebook in the other. Each movement was deliberate. Every few paces, Roy would stop, bend slightly, and take a measurement, sometimes adjusting a thin string line that was now stretched between 2 stakes embedded in the grass. There was no attempt to hide it anymore. Jaina refused to watch. She moved through the house silently now, speaking only when necessary, shutting curtains earlier than usual, reacting to sounds with visible tension. Her routines had changed. She no longer walked outside alone. She no longer worked in the garden. The back patio, once her quiet place for morning tea, had gone unused for days. And when the wind knocked over a flower pot one afternoon, she startled so hard she dropped a plate. Michael swept up the pieces without speaking. The final push came 3 days later when the letter arrived by certified mail. This time it was addressed directly. Mr. and Mrs. Hanson, Parcel 7B. The envelope was heavier than the others, thick with inserts. Inside, there were 5 documents, all carefully formatted, printed on matte paper with an embossed letterhead that read, Residential Alignment Authority. The content was more elaborate than before. One page featured a topographic overlay of their property, highlighting what Roy, or whoever had authored the documents, called interference zones. Another displayed a mathematical analysis of angles, setbacks, and harmonic alignment deviation. Ratios, claiming that the placement of their driveway, mailbox, and front-facing windows created disruptive triangulation within the block's visual matrix. There were charts, color-coded blocks, even a resident compliance score ranked out of 100. The Hansons had been assigned a 62. At the bottom of the last page was a recommendation. Structural reconfiguration suggested. Consultation window open until end of Q2. Non-participation will be logged as spatial defiance. Jaina stared at the phrase spatial defiance for a full minute before tearing the page in half and walking out of the room. Michael didn't stop her. That night, he called Denise again. Her tone was sharper now. This man is building a bureaucratic cult around himself, and he's trying to recruit you as the villain. She explained she had begun compiling everything into a formal legal document: photos, maps, timestamps, communications, preparing for a restraining order that would include a cease and desist for harassment and psychological intimidation. But I also reached out to someone else, she added, a former zoning inspector who consults on abnormal code enforcement tactics. He's seen things like this. He'll stop by this week. The consultant's name was Bradley York. He was tall, dry-voiced, and walked like a man who had once served in the military but never mentioned it. He arrived 2 days later in a truck with no branding and introduced himself with a simple nod. Michael walked him through the situation, showing every photo, every document, every marked object. Bradley didn't ask many questions. He observed, quietly. For nearly 2 hours he paced the Hansons' property, examining every stake, every line, every etched symbol. At one point he knelt and ran his fingers over one of the reflective discs, then turned to Michael with an almost amused look. "It's brass-plated," he said, "custom machined. This wasn't bought online. He made these himself." Back inside, Bradley flipped through the documents with the eye of someone used to catching manipulations in the fine print. "He's mimicking municipal formatting," he said. "Not perfectly, but enough to trick someone who isn't familiar with actual codes. He's using alignment theory and visual discipline language, stuff borrowed from old urban design literature. A lot of it's taken out of context, distorted, but it's not random." He set the pages down. "This man believes he's restoring order." Jaina, who had remained quiet through most of the visit, finally spoke. "He's rewriting the world, and we're the mistake." Bradley nodded. "Yes, that's exactly it." They stood in silence for a moment before he continued. "You're not alone. I've seen similar cases, usually in rural areas, small communities where a single person builds an alternative system around themselves. The goal isn't control for power's sake. It's correction. He doesn't see himself as the enemy. He sees himself as the last line of defense against chaos." Michael asked what usually stopped people like that. Bradley didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Either the law intervenes hard and early, or something breaks, and you don't want to be around when it does." Denise filed the restraining order the next day. Roy didn't respond, not publicly. But 2 days later, the Hansons found a new object on their porch. A white box, unmarked, with no return label. Inside was a level tool, the kind used in construction, except this one had been modified. The bubble inside had been permanently fixed in the center with epoxy. It couldn't move. Underneath it, taped to the base, was a note: "Stability is possible." That night, the back gate creaked open just past midnight. Michael, already awake, stepped outside with a flashlight and a phone in hand. He didn't speak, he didn't shout, He simply stared into the dark yard where the motion sensor light had triggered and watched as it slowly flickered back off. He returned inside and locked the door behind him. The next morning, the cameras had caught nothing. No figures, no sound, only the gate swinging open, then shut again. Bradley returned one last time. He walked the yard again, this time checking the trees, the corners, the drainage pipes. Then he asked if the Hansons had ever noticed any change in their GPS signal or Wi-Fi strength near the front door. Michael hesitated, then remembered. Yes, in fact. His phone often dropped to one bar as soon as he stepped outside. Bradley nodded slowly. "He's running interference," he said. "There's probably a low-grade signal disruptor somewhere near the property line. It's subtle. Illegal, but subtle. It scrambles just enough to delay uploads, block surveillance, confuse smart systems, makes you feel off balance, doesn't show up on normal scans." Jaina looked at Michael. "He's trying to erase us." Michael shook his head. Not erase. Align. But that distinction no longer mattered, because now the issue wasn't just territorial or psychological. It was technological. It was calculated. And it was about to reach the point of no return. The next morning, Michael stepped outside and noticed something had changed. The eastern edge of their yard, a part of the lawn Jaina had once fussed over with her usual precision, now bore a half-moon incision, a perfect semicircle cut into the grass, removed down to the root with surgical accuracy. It wasn't visible from the front porch or windows unless one deliberately walked the fence line and looked down at the base of the slope. But once seen, it was unmistakable. The earth beneath was moist and dark, the grass carefully stripped. In the dead center of that arc sat a single metal disc, flush with the soil, no wider than a poker chip, gleaming with an intentional sheen. When Michael crouched to examine it, he noticed something strange. The ground seemed to hum, a subtle, rhythmic vibration that didn't feel like machinery or wind. It was internal, low, like the ambient pressure of a working system buried just beneath the surface. He didn't touch it. He didn't even linger. Instead, he stood up slowly, walked back inside, and called Denise. She answered immediately, listened without interrupting, then told him not to disturb the object, to take detailed photos, and to stay off that part of the lawn. She said she'd notify a city infrastructure inspector, someone authorized to examine installations that might involve underground utilities or unlawful transmission devices. Michael followed instructions. He photographed the soil, the semicircle, the disc. He even measured the radius and charted it onto a printed version of their parcel layout. By midday, a county vehicle arrived. Plain white, no insignia beyond a serial number. A quiet man in khakis and work boots introduced himself as Mark Feeney, a field tech from the Public Works Department. He didn't comment much. He used a handheld scanner and a shallow probe, examined the disc and surrounding area with a practiced eye, then made a note and looked at Michael. "It's active," he said. "Transmitting something. Low frequency. Probably data. Could be a DIY soil sensor system, telemetry, or EM distortion device. Not city authorized, but I've seen worse." Jaina stood back from them, barely breathing, arms crossed so tightly it looked painful. She didn't ask questions. She didn't want to know the details. Feeney took more readings and explained that while technically they couldn't remove anything planted even an inch beyond the recorded boundary line, the presence of an unregistered device that could affect communications or data reception on adjacent properties would be escalated. He left a card, logged the incident, and drove off, promising to send an official complaint to the Code Enforcement Office. But everyone knew how long those complaints sat unprocessed. That evening, the air around the house changed. The silence wasn't calming anymore. It felt like standing inside an invisible dome, where pressure wasn't physical but psychological. Jaina closed all the curtains before dusk, then closed them again an hour later just to be sure. Michael double-checked the camera system. Not because he expected anything new to appear, but because he had to feel like something was still in his control. The footage always showed the same thing: darkness, nothing, the occasional flicker of a squirrel, wind pushing the hedges. But they both knew the real things. The true movements were happening in ways the cameras couldn't see. Then came the tire spikes. They weren't visible at first. Michael had gone to retrieve some building supplies, reversing the SUV out of the driveway as usual. Then came the sound, a dull metallic crunch followed by a rapid hiss. He stopped immediately. All 4 tires flattened within seconds. When he stepped out, he saw them, sleek, dark, matte-finished metal strips embedded across the entrance of the driveway. Not police-style spike strips, not something one could casually roll over and survive. These were fitted into the concrete, molded to the surface, designed to appear as nothing until pressure was applied. He crouched, ran a finger along one, and felt how carefully they had been filed, how perfectly they fit. The car behind him now rested on its rims, slumped like an animal with its legs taken out. Jaina came outside. She didn't scream. She didn't even ask what happened. She looked at the tires, then at the ground, then turned around and walked back inside, as though her body couldn't stand to absorb anything more. Michael stood in the driveway for a long time. Then he took photos. Lots of them. Close-ups, wide shots, elevation angles. Then he called Denise. She was furious. Her voice was flat but sharp. She called it sabotage, told him to contact law enforcement immediately, and then texted a formal outline of a claim she was preparing to file. Not just for harassment, but for targeted destruction of property and unlawful modification of private accessways. Michael didn't need to ask her what would happen next. He knew. There would be paperwork, letters, weeks of waiting. When Officer Cray showed up, he examined the spikes with a strange kind of resignation. He was polite, as always, but his jaw was tight and he didn't ask many questions. "You got any video?" he asked. Michael shook his head. "Figures," Cray muttered, tapping the edge of the spikes with his pen. "Whoever did this knows what they're doing. Industrial quality, ground-cut installation. I doubt they even made noise." Michael told him it wasn't about noise. It was about control, about precision. Roy hadn't left a message this time. He had let the spikes speak for him. Cray said he'd file it as sabotage and property tampering, but without footage or an eyewitness, it wouldn't go far. Michael didn't expect it to. The spikes remained for 3 days. The car couldn't be moved without tearing more rubber. A towing company refused to enter the property, citing liability. County maintenance said it wasn't their jurisdiction. In the end, Michael had to hire a concrete resurfacing crew. Private, expensive, thorough. They ground out the edges of the driveway and removed the embedded strips one by one, then re-poured and sealed the surface. The bill was over $4,000. The insurance company rejected the claim outright. Jaina didn't leave the house at all during those days. She stopped going near the windows. She kept her phone on silent. At night, she sat in the living room and stared at the floor, the television on but muted. Michael tried to maintain routines, swept the back porch, made coffee every morning, read articles he couldn't focus on, but everything had become performative. There was no normal left to return to. They were occupying a house that was no longer theirs, at least not fully. Then came the knock. Not on the front door. On the side. 3 short, evenly timed knocks. Michael checked the cameras. No one. He opened the curtain slowly. Nothing. But when he opened the side door, he found a manila envelope lying on the step, held down by a single brass washer. Inside were 5 photographs. High-resolution, aerial-style shots of their backyard, their bedroom window, their living room at dusk. Each had red ink notes in the margins. Angle acceptable. Light spill unacceptable. Curtain deviation noted. At the bottom was a business card that wasn't from any business. Phase 3, review underway. Jaina didn't speak for 2 days after that. She stayed in the guest room and kept the lights off. Michael didn't press her. He just sat at the foot of their bed and stared at the envelope, still open on the dresser. That weekend, Bradley returned. He brought a sensor kit. He scanned the yard, the trees, the drain pipes, even the air near the metal disc. Then he stopped and asked a strange question. Had Michael noticed his phone dropping signal when stepping outside? Michael had. Often. Bradley nodded. He's using low-grade jammers, weak enough not to trigger FCC flags, strong enough to interfere with wireless transmission. It's not just about seeing you, it's about cutting you off, disorienting you. Jaina stood in the hallway behind them. She didn't say it aloud, but her eyes did. He's trying to erase us. Michael whispered, No, not erase, a line. But deep down, he knew those were now the same thing, because Roy wasn't just removing resistance, he was removing variance. And that's when Michael knew. The war was no longer over property. It was over identity. Michael didn't sleep the night after Bradley confirmed the signal jamming. It wasn't fear keeping him up anymore. It was clarity. Everything Roy had done, the measurement stakes, the white lines, the structural language, the numeric designations, the reflective markers, the triangulated spikes, even the blank-faced silence, had built toward one conclusion. They weren't being pushed out by force. They were being pushed inward, bent, compressed into a configuration Roy had decided was acceptable. Their lives were being folded into a geometric structure he had imagined, and the pressure of that fold was growing. Jaina, who had not left the house in over a week, now walked silently from room to room, closing and reopening doors, adjusting curtains with mechanical precision, wiping down counters that weren't dirty. She hadn't spoken to anyone outside of Michael in days, and even with him her words were short, measured. When he asked if she wanted him to book a hotel, just to give her space or a break, she said no, but the word didn't carry the tone of a decision. It sounded like a pre-programmed setting, a residual command in a system that no longer had user control. The next escalation came in the form of silence. No letters, no markings, no packages, nothing. For 2 days, the house sat unviolated. It should have been a relief. Instead, it created a vacuum, a stillness that felt unnatural, like the absence of pressure before a structure collapses inward. Michael couldn't shake the sensation that Roy was still watching, still listening, but had moved into a different phase of the operation, something invisible. Then, just past the second day, Michael opened the back gate and found a crate on the ground. It wasn't addressed and it wasn't sealed. Inside were 29 metal stakes, identical to the ones Roy had placed before, but this time each one was etched with the letter H. Alongside them lay a laminated sheet with a simple diagram. The Hansen house, surrounded by equidistant markings on all sides. A full perimeter map. Each location pre-measured, labeled, and coded. The implication was clear. You don't live here anymore. You exist here, within boundaries I've defined. Michael didn't call anyone. He carried the crate into the garage and left it there. He didn't show Jaina, not because he was hiding it, but because he didn't want to give the structure more room to grow. He began unplugging things. Security cameras, smart lights, motion sensors, not all at once, one at a time. Every hour something else went dark. He replaced the porch light with a red bulb, moved the house numbers to the back fence, laid bricks diagonally across the front walk. Roy's system relied on predictability, on patterns, on a measurable architecture, and Michael had finally accepted that he couldn't win the game Roy was playing. But he could make the board unreadable. That same night, Michael took a sledgehammer from the garage and went to the rear fence. He didn't do it in anger. He didn't even hesitate. He began dismantling it one board at a time, reshaping the line of sight from their yard to the neighboring property. He cleared the space not to open it, but to twist it, to force Roy to see something he couldn't account for. When the gap was wide enough, Michael dragged a full-length mirror out and propped it up on a cinder block facing the neighbor's house. Then he left it there. Not hidden, not explained, just part of the new layout. Roy didn't react, at least not publicly. But within a day, more changes appeared. A red laser dot shined intermittently across their windows at night, moving in perfectly horizontal sweeps. Not a weapon, a measure, a scan. Jaina saw it once and quietly moved to the hallway without speaking. Michael no longer tried to reassure her. There was nothing to say that could dilute the truth. They were now pieces in a system that someone else controlled. The house had become a grid, and the grid had begun to rotate. The next night, someone entered the backyard. There were no broken locks, no triggered alarms. Michael had turned those off already. But when he woke and stepped outside, he saw that the mirror had been turned inward. Now it faced the house. The message was clear. Roy had completed the loop. The perimeter was closed. The system had achieved total integration. Michael stood before the mirror for a long time, staring not at his reflection, but at the frame, at the small scrape on the corner of the glass where the moonlight bent. It wasn't anger he felt. It wasn't even fear anymore. It was understanding. Roy wasn't fighting them. He was refining them. This had never been about punishment. It was about correction. In his eyes, the Hansons were misaligned shapes inside a structure that needed completion. And now the structure had closed. That morning, Jaina told Michael she wanted to leave. Not forever, not yet, but for a day. She needed to feel air outside of the grid. She asked him to drive. They left together, locking the house behind them, not saying much. They drove without music, without conversation, through rural side roads until they reached a small lakeside park. There, for the first time in weeks, Jaina took off her shoes and walked across uneven stones barefoot. Michael followed her. They didn't talk about Roy, or the system, or the stakes, or the mirror. They just existed in an unpatterned space, where nothing aligned and nothing needed to. When they returned, a single object had been placed at their front door. A large industrial bolt, sharpened at one end, embedded upright into a block of cement. Tied around it was a tag that simply read, "Stability secured." There were no more words. The implication was absolute. Michael carried the block to the garage and covered it with a tarp. That evening, he dismantled the last remaining camera. He shut off their router. He unplugged every smart outlet. Then, he took a paint roller and coated the inside of every front-facing window with black primer. Jaina didn't ask why. She helped. Together, they removed every visual link between their world and Roy's. And when it was done, they sat in the living room, surrounded by silence, not trapped, but undefined. No patterns, no signals, just space. Roy never came over. He never confronted them. He never trespassed again. But the grid remained, and the Hansons understood now. It didn't need to be visible, because once you're mapped, you never really go back to zero. Weeks passed. The house remained quiet. The weather shifted. Rain fell for 2 days straight, soaking the ground, softening the soil where markers once stood like commands embedded in dirt. The reflective discs dulled under layers of wet leaves, and the chalk lines dissolved into runoff that flowed into the curb like remnants of a blueprint that no longer mattered. Michael no longer monitored the cameras. He had taken them down, boxed them, and left the box in the attic along with the old router and the infrared bulbs. There was no sense in watching anymore. Observation had been Roy's weapon, not theirs. Surveillance meant expectation, and expectation meant control. Jaina had started to move differently. She wasn't quite herself again, not the woman who had once color-coded every storage bin in the garage and planned meals 2 weeks ahead. But she wasn't dissolving anymore either. She had resumed cooking simple things, walking the perimeter with a rake in hand, humming quietly when she thought she was alone. The back patio light remained unplugged, and the blinds stayed closed. That hadn't changed. But her silence was no longer full of fear. It was space she was keeping, not retreating into. Michael didn't try to define it. He accepted it, understood it the way one understands the aftershock of a storm, not as something to fix, but something to adapt to. Roy hadn't been seen in days. His lawn was still immaculate, his windows still dark, his car still motionless in the driveway like a statue or a relic. But there were no more crates, no more diagrams, no more symbols. It wasn't that he had vanished. It was that the ritual had ended. The structure was complete. Whatever logic he had built, whatever silent satisfaction he had drawn from pinning down the world one coordinate at a time, he no longer needed to prove it. The Hansons had been filed, indexed, cataloged. They were now part of the background, inert variables that no longer disrupted the balance. And in that strange, quiet, twisted way, Michael understood that Roy had achieved what he set out to do. The neighborhood didn't intervene. They never had. There were no meetings, no collective action, just occasional glances from behind hedges. Neighbors who once smiled now averting their eyes. A subtle but unmistakable message. We saw it, we let it happen, and we're not part of it. The isolation was complete, but the fear had evaporated. One morning, Michael went into the garage and began rebuilding the shelves. He didn't say why. He didn't announce it as a project. He just started. He threw out the broken levelers, the bent measuring tape, the buckets that had sat untouched for months. Jaina came in halfway through and handed him a box of screws without speaking. He nodded. That was all. By midday, the wall was cleaner than it had been in a year. They didn't restore order. They replaced it. New hooks, new layout, nothing symmetrical, just functional. That evening, they pulled chairs into the driveway and sat facing west. The sun took longer to set that day. Neither of them spoke. A week later, a city utility truck arrived unannounced. A crew of 3 men stepped out, began measuring the edge of the Roy's property with surveying tools, took notes, then placed 2 orange flags near his mailbox. They didn't knock on doors. They didn't ask questions. They marked the street, entered coordinates into a device, and drove away. The next day, another truck came. This one carried a technician from the power company. He accessed a ground panel near Roy's garage, ran diagnostics, and left without touching anything else. Something was happening. Quiet, administrative, official. Michael didn't ask. He didn't need to. It was Denise who confirmed it. She called him that evening, her voice lighter than it had been in months. "There's a municipal order pending," she said. "One of the zoning cases I filed triggered a deeper audit. Turns out your neighbor has installed unlicensed infrastructure on public easement territory. Someone flagged it at the county level. There's now a motion to decommission all unauthorized ground units within the subdivision, starting with Parcel 7A. Quietly, legally. No confrontation." Michael listened, then said, "Thank you." She paused before hanging up. "I think you broke the pattern. He tried to fold you in. You didn't fold. That's what saved you." Roy's light stayed off. No trucks came for him. No confrontation arrived at his door. He was simply being dismantled from the outside, bit by bit, in the language he understood best, official language, coded language, numbers and markers. It didn't matter if he knew who filed what. It didn't matter if he ever responded. His system was being deconstructed without a sound. One morning, Michael noticed the triangle of reflective discs had vanished. The driveway was bare again. There was no sign of who had removed them. But the concrete looked smoother, as if something had been filled, sealed, erased. By the start of the next month, Michael and Jaina hosted their daughter for a weekend visit. They didn't explain everything. They didn't need to. She asked if they'd had trouble adjusting to the new place. Jaina smiled and said, "We had to make room." That was all. That night, as the three of them sat on the back patio listening to frogs echoing from the retention pond behind the hill, Michael looked toward Roy's yard. It was as perfect as ever, but it no longer loomed. It just existed. He looked at the sky and let himself breathe. Not because the threat was gone, but because it no longer owned his shape. They didn't win, but they didn't break. And sometimes, that's more than enough.